Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Force Society for Kids Mental Health monthly In the Know Education and Networking webinar series. Funding is provided by the BC Mental Health and Substance Use Services, an agency of the Provincial Health Services Authority, and by the BC Ministry of Children and Family Development in collaboration with the Kelty Mental Health Resource Centre. My name is Julie Collette, and I'm a parent in residence for the Force Society for Kids Mental Health at the Kelty Mental Health Resource Centre, and we are broadcasting from BC Women's Health Centre at BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver. Our topic today is paying attention, relationship or behavior, parenting with a different focus in mind. All the In the Know sessions have been recorded and can be viewed in our archives at any time. So please visit the Force website at www.forcesociety.com/intheknow to access past sessions. In a moment, I will introduce for this webinar, but first I would like to remind everyone to fill out the online feedback forms after you finish watching this webinar. Online viewers can go directly to the online presentation links icon at the lower bottom right of your screen, which looks like a paperclip, and you'll find the feedback form there. You also have the option of entering to win a $50 Chapters gift card for filling out the feedback form, and all the information is confidential and is only used to collect feedback from you that helps develop our future In the Know sessions and topic ideas. In the resources section, you will find a downloadable copy of the PowerPoint from this webinar, and remember you can review the webinar as often as you like. So thanks so much everyone for joining us today, and now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Marianne Crabtree, who is in the blue, is a youth and family counselor and has a Master's of Social Work. Marianne has been working as a youth and family counselor with boys and girls clubs, substance abuse counseling, and parent support groups since 1988, providing addictions counseling and facilitating groups for parents of teens. Alexandra Wilson, parent engagement lead for the SASSY initiative, which is Substance or School-Age Child and Youth Initiative, Substance Misuse Prevention and Health Promotion Program at Vancouver School Board. She has worked with Vancouver Coastal Health and the Vancouver School Board in parent support, education, engagement for parents of teens since 2007. She has a Master's in Education in Human Development, Learning and Culture, and is a Connect Parent Group Facilitator. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you. So Marianne and I have been invited to talk a little bit about how we can talk with our kids about substance use, and in that context with youth who are maybe pretty committed to their substance use. Maybe it's regular, frequent, there's a consistent pattern of behavior. And we just wanted to start off by saying that we're starting with a few assumptions, and that is that as parents we work hard to connect with our kids, that we want to stay close with them, and that we've all tried multiple ways to keep our kids safe and maybe to get them to take their safety more seriously. And in that process, maybe over years, we felt shut down or not listened to. So maybe sometimes we start to feel a little bit burnt out or fed up or maybe even helpless. So today one of the things that we want to talk about is being open to trying something new, or if it's not something new, maybe trying the same things in a slightly different way. So our focus today is to talk a little bit more about process than about outcome. Instead of concentrating on managing youth behavior, we want to concentrate a little bit on the interactive process between us as parents and youth.
Okay, so today we want to talk about strengthening the relationship as a parenting strategy. And maybe this is adding to a toolkit, might be time to try something new, and just recognizing there isn't just one way of parenting. Sometimes we need to adapt what we're doing if things aren't working. It's useful, I think, to work on the relationship as it gets us into a position where we can talk about some of those difficult issues. I also think we bring hope because this does work. It gets us back to a place where we can maybe be a guide or a consultant to our teens. And, you know, the days of being completely in charge or in control are over, if you actually ever have that. The relationship is what we need to talk about anything with our teens, and particularly some of the more difficult topics. We all, I think, want our teens to end up in the same place. I think we have a lot of the same goals. We want our kids to be decent, happy, successful people, maybe making good decisions. And maybe we're kind of thinking that this might be a more successful way to get us to that place. So we let you kind of imagine the bigger picture or the end goal of where we want our kids to be, and not focus maybe so much on the day-to-day stuff, because that's not going to reflect the end goal as well. Why strengthen the relationship as a parenting strategy? Well, we think it's effective. It doesn't do any harm, and it can only help. Kind of as we can see on the slide, we have some influence. We can become role models. Our teens start to trust us more and feel that we support them when our relationship is stronger. As a result, we think that they're more willing to listen to us, and that's how we can also start working on behavior. We can start planting the seeds, sharing our views, and starting to have discussions rather than maybe providing advice or lecturing. We also think the connection being strong works really well with adolescent development. Their tasks are becoming their own person, making their own decisions, developing their own identity. And working with relationship rather than behavior management is better addresses those things. Because human beings learn best in the context of a healthy relationship. We can look to business or education, psychology, human resources, and in all those areas they recognize the importance of first having a strong relationship and then doing the work that they do. So we want to try that as well with parenting. Having that relationship first is that basis for then us to move into doing a good job as a parent. Building the relationship does mean that we have to put on hold sometimes dealing with their troublesome behavior. Just putting that aside for the moment. Another point I just want to add in is kind of an important reminder that we've started to talk about teens, and I find myself doing that as well, about it being acting out behavior or defiant behavior. And actually, that's not really kind of an accurate description of that. What it really is their behavior symptoms. They're signs that something's going wrong. So when kids act in this way, generally, there's something troubling going on for them underneath. And so the relationship building is going to get us there much more likely than anything else.
So our relationship is the foundation for emotional growth and development for our kids. And, that's true when they're little, but it's equally true when they're teenagers. So when our children are babies and young children, we're very aware that they need our physical proximity as well as our emotional proximity. And sure, as our kids get older and into the teenage years, maybe they need us to be less around physically, but they still need us to be around emotionally. They need that emotional proximity, and they need to know that we've got their backs. It's actually something that teens count on, and they're right to count on, that when they go out and explore the world and they make decisions and maybe things go wrong, if things go sideways, that they should be able to call their parents. We're that safety net. So we can still set boundaries. We can still have limits while supporting the relationship. An example I often think of is if you've got a child who has a part-time job and has been staying out late and missing classes and is late for work 3 times, and the 4th time it's like, you got to drive me, Mom, you got to get me. If I don't get there to work, it'll be your fault if I'm fired. And we can say things like, I'd love to help you out, honey. In fact, I actually have time to drive you, but you meant to say, please, Mom, best mom in the world. You want to give me a ride, eh? So we can still work with that and the relationship.
Okay, maybe you are, if we're looking at the first point on the slide, maybe you are saying, I am close with my teen and I am still having lots of problems with their behavior. Or there's lots concerning me about them. And that makes sense that we may think that, but also what can be happening is that our kids are actually not feeling the same way. So we may think we're really close and our kids are feeling quite differently. And I think that can happen when we get caught trying to manage behavior and focus mainly on the behavior. We start acting in ways that actually don't reflect our true intentions. So we may be worried about something or really afraid about it, and yet we might be coming across a lot differently. We might be kind of acting like I'm mad at you, or I don't like you, you're a disappointment, or I don't really care about you right now. So that's what teens hear, even if that's not what we're trying to say. And so we want to get this back on track. Relationships are a two-way street, but when it comes to our teens, we think at this time it isn't exactly equal. although we could often fall into a pattern, if a teen is rude to us and disrespectful, we can kind of say, well, I'm not going to be nice to them then. And that can maybe feel right, and that might feel fair, and it might be kind of what we want to do, and yet the kind of guideline we want to bring in now is it effective? And is that effective way of bringing your kid closer to you and having some input? And on that count, we would probably say no. So we have to go, one of us is a grown-up, who's going to be the bigger person? And to both of those, we would say it has to be us. We need to be the ones that are going to pay attention to the relationship. We're the ones who really want to try and steer it into more positive directions.
So the good news is that focusing on the relationship and thinking about the way we communicate with youth really works with their development. So this is a super, just brief, touching on a few things, but I wanted to point out that the In the Know series has in the archives a great session on brain development in adolescence, so take a look at that. If you're interested in books, Dan Siegel's book Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain is an excellent resource. Or a 45-minute episode, CBC's The Nature of Things, has David Suzuki's episode titled Surviving the Teenage Brain on the CBC website. Great, and a lot more information. So it seems to be becoming more common knowledge that the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. So usually between the ages of 15 and some experts say 25. So all of this area, all those executive functioning are just starting to develop in adolescence. And when we work with kids, when we ask them what they're thinking, what their plans are, how they would like to have something unfold, what we're doing is we're helping to light up the prefrontal cortex and encouraging them to do the thinking. And this, in turn, ties in really well with that whole drive for independence. So it's completely normal that kids want to be both self-reliant and have us be their backup, right? Those aren't actually conflicting ideas. It's just a norm. But one of the things we can kind of accidentally do is trigger what we call teenage counter-will. And that's kind of that moment where the parent says, wow, what a beautiful day, the sky's so blue. And the kid says, not really. I mean, even if factually speaking, the sky is very blue. And it's almost like they can't help it. And so sometimes when we tell our kids what to do, we end up triggering that reaction. And they may well have been thinking about the exact thing that we've just said. And somehow the minute we've said it, it's harder for them to think it for themselves. So again, helping them to explore ideas, asking open-ended questions. As we go on, we're going to have some really specific examples about that here, can be helpful. And you know, part of that independence is what we call individuation. So where a teenager is sorting out who they are for themselves, kind of separate from their parents. And I've always found it way more helpful to think of this not as rejecting of parents, but as no longer idealizing us. We're kind of like shoved off the pedestal. So that can be a little bit painful. But in the bigger picture, that is actually what we want. We don't want 30-year-olds who, for whom the last word on everything in their lives comes from their parents, right? We want people who can think for themselves. So finally, in the identity development, which is a lot of what is going on now, youth are figuring out who they are through their interactions with other people and through their time alone. So when we encourage them to do things that are high sensation, so I kind of think, like, let's not think about risk-taking. Let's think about sensation-seeking, right? When we can encourage youth to get involved in theater sports, in competitive athletics, in supporting them to ask that girl out for coffee or to go on a dog walk together, those things that give you that rush of fear, increased sensation, those are all the experiences that help youth grow and develop socially and emotionally during these years. And we can support that development also in terms of being very strengths-based in our language. So, for example, we can acknowledge small efforts, not completed success, right? We can acknowledge small steps in the right direction. Like, you made it to school every day this week. I'm really glad to see how responsible you are. And maybe they weren't there on time, but we don't have to say that. You know, or when we hear about their friends and some of the decisions may sound a little scary, and yet it sounds like the friends are looking out for each other. It sounds like you've got some good friends. You know, thanks for making an effort to get along with your brother. I really appreciate it. And that's even when it wasn't perfect. So parents actually have a lot of influence on supporting youth to develop a positive self-image. And we can see more of a negative self-image develop when there's things like name calling, blaming, or shaming. So one of the things I like about this approach is that it gives us an opportunity to be really intentional and ask ourselves, this thing that I'm going to do, will it strengthen the relationship? So we can be responsive rather than reactive. Okay, so just to highlight a little bit about this particular slide, this can be quite a useful way to think about substance use when we are talking about adults or when we're looking at kind of drugs and society in general. But one of the things I just really want to highlight for us as parents or anyone who's working with young people is that we need to take a developmental approach to understanding substance use. So just like when we were just talking about adolescent brain development and all the social and emotional development, we want to understand that teens are at a different place than adults. So we may have a 45-year-old man who has a marriage and friends and a good job and hangs out with his kids and has a hobby he loves and is physically active and smokes cannabis on the weekend, and we can say, well, you know, adults make the decisions that they make and we don't know anything about his mental health or his physical health, but maybe that's okay. But if we have a 15-year-old who gets good grades, who has friends, who has a hobby he loves, he has dinner with his family, still hangs out with his younger siblings, he's involved in a sport, and he smokes weed on the weekend, whatever else you might say about all those positive protective factors in that young person's life, they're still 15. And they have a lot of growing to do, socially, emotionally, and in terms of brain changes. So I think it's problematic to think of non-problematic use for teenagers in that kind of big category.
I totally agree. And had we got another slide to the PowerPoint on time, we would be able to show now kind of a more user-friendly stages of use sheet that we kind of show to parents and to teens. And in that one, we don't actually have non-problematic use, because again, that idea that is there really any use that's not problematic. Although we also want to say any less use is creating less problems too. But in this other version, we look at experimental use, which might be 1 or 2 times, occasional use or social, regular use, and then it maybe moves more into problematic or problematic and misuse or abuse. We want to remember, and I think where this one can catch us is this is that adult version. And so the youth version, we want to look at experimental use really as just those 1 or 2 times. This is an opportunity to try something. Not that I'm encouraging that, but if they do, to find out maybe I actually don't like this, and then to go back to non-use, which is actually the first part of that, the other form that we have. Otherwise, they might move on to occasional use. And occasional use, again, in a parent's eyes, might sometimes look like it's just on weekends. Well, at least they're only doing it occasionally. But from a youth perspective, that is probably moving more into regular use. So if it's happening every weekend, that's kind of regularly happening. What we like about bringing in this is sometimes we can talk to parents or to teens just where they're at on that continuum. And the first thing we always like to say is, we try not to say, don't use drugs, because sometimes that counter role kicks in and says, yes, I will, but we want to say delay. The later you start, the less you're going to affect your brain development. The other thing is to look at their social and emotional development, which Alexandra just talked about, and doing that under the influence is going to really affect learning in those areas. So we can speak to them about, even if they are using in a way that we're not okay with, is there times where you can go to that party and not use, and kind of learn how to have relationships, learn how to be with other people when you're not using. How do you deal with your first heartache or some really strong emotions? That we want to try and do that sometimes when we're not under the influence. We like to do that all the time, but if that's not the option, sometimes it's better. When use moves more into regular use for a teen, we also have to start acknowledging that maybe there's something going on underneath that. That's not always really fun when we're kind of needing it every day or to get through the day. And so what we want to do is start realizing that there's something underneath that, and those substances are helping them cope with something. So asking sometimes what's good about your using, or what would be so difficult, what would be hard if you had to quit. Doesn't endorse using, but it actually gives us an opportunity to find out what use is like for them. So is this helping them deal with anxiety? Is it helping them cope with the stress of school, or just a way to kind of zone out and not have to think about some things that don't feel very good to think about? That gives an opportunity to check into that. We can look into start exploring underlying issues with them, or we can be steering our teens to some extra supports where they can maybe explore that with somebody else. As we talk about, there's no non-problematic use for youth. We also want to say that whenever kids stop, however much they use, they'll always get better when that gets reduced or taken out of their lives. And remembering how adaptable and plastic the brain is, that they can always kind of fix that up a bit. So it's certainly not a tragedy, or it's not what am I trying to say here?
It's not cast in stone.
It's irreversible. We can reverse some of the effects of
Absolutely.
that.
I think a lot of what, when we have young people who maybe are using regularly and are using to cope with uncomfortable emotions and painful circumstance, yes, on the one hand, that means they're not learning other skills. On the other hand, these are things that we learn throughout our lifetime, that they can learn at 15, or they can learn at 20, or they can learn at 25. And just developmentally, what we know is that it's kind of better to learn it in adolescence. I have a colleague who says, if you have a teenager who has a heartbreak and recovers from a teenage heartbreak at 17, they know they can survive anything, because that's a tough one. So just going a little bit lighter, because I think the idea that these are hard conversations, which is why we want to start with the idea that you want to look at where your relationship is at. If everything is escalating into huge fights and not talking, you're not going to just pounce on them when they walk in the door and say, "What's so good about substance use?" Right? We're gonna start in a smaller way. So there's some ideas on the screen, and I often think, if every time a child comes home, it's to hear, "You're late again, I bet you didn't do your homework, the dishes weren't washed, and you promised this time, were you out with those awful friends again, you smell like pot." I like us to take a little step back and think, what does that feel like? What does that feel like if every time you come home you're a disappointment or a source of grief and anger to your parents? And imagine how much different it would be if when you walked in, your parents said, completely sincerely and not sarcastically, "Oh, that's nice, you're home," or "I'm glad you're safe." That small thing can shift the relationship quite strongly, and sometimes that feels like too much, and we can hear they come in, so we know they're home safe, and maybe we can just say nothing if we can't say something welcoming, or we can go to bed so that we don't see them, but really just be able to maybe just try and be happy that they are home safe. So this doesn't endorse behavior, this approach. You can still talk about it if a child comes home intoxicated later, when they aren't under the influence, and maybe when you feel calm, right? This is just being effective. It's not endorsement. And one of the things we can do is focus on the fact that our concerns have to do with adolescent health and adolescent safety, and not to do with teen defiance.
Okay. So what we want to do is try and see the best in their behavior. Notice the kind of minuscule things. So did they come into the room and turn on the TV when you were reading to bug you because they wanted the bigger screen? Or maybe they wanted to be near you and they're feeling a little bit vulnerable because they know they've been acting in ways that worry you right now. If they really wanted to be near you, or if they didn't really want to be near you, they could have gone and used their phone or used the computer or gone to a friend's house. So we want to assume the best in their gestures. We want to maybe assume they want to connect, not to bug you. Even if you were wrong, we can still bring out better behavior than assuming the worst. And that brings better behavior out in us as parents as well as in our teens. So if we kind of think about relationship with some of these examples on the screen, we can ask, how can I make a connection out of a request? We might say when they phone late, phone for a ride late and drunk, to say, "I'm glad you called for a ride, and I'm really, really worried about how much you're drinking," or "I'm really worried about your drinking," and we'll talk about that later. When they come home late at night, we don't have a lot of late night examples, but that's kind of teen time. "I like hearing how your night went, and I need to work early tomorrow, so can we maybe talk about this another time?" So we can also set limits with behavior, and we can do that respectfully. The language we use does affect our relationship. So if we see a lie as trying to protect us, or maybe not to have us worry, rather than think they're dishonest, how will our relationship be effective? You know, I know there's a common response to that saying, well, I'm not going to let them get away with it. And yet I think calling kids on lies and trying to prove that they are actually doesn't make kids lie less. It sometimes can encourage more lying. Counter wills kicking in at times like that. And other things that we can do, like asking them to do things together and making sure that when we are asking to do things together, it's not an opportunity to get them cornered to say, okay, did you get your homework done? Why aren't you doing dishes? What's going on? You're not talking to me. You know, we just want to go and have those fun experiences again. So again, when we're dealing with troubling behavior, a lot of our time is spent on that management and not having fun or quality time with our kids.
So speaking of lying, if they are lying, I actually agree with Marianne. I think at that point it's all the more reason to make working on the relationship a priority, right? Sometimes we as parents can get really caught up in that sense of, but this is a value. I am not so angry that they were drinking. I'm angry because they lied about it. And I think if we can take it up even a higher level to an even bigger picture, which is if we're at a point where there's just a lot of lying and a lot of calling each other out on things and a lot of escalating, can we set aside just temporarily that value of telling the truth all the time in order to get to a place where we can then actually have conversations about what's going on. So I think kind of he said, she said isn't so much the point, right? It's about what's that bigger picture and about trying to be effective. Okay, do you want to?
I think I will move on. So sometimes it is really, really hard. Sometimes you and your kids aren't even talking or they're swearing at you. And yet responding to a FU sounds like you're having a really bad day might help get at what's going on underneath. We like to sometimes imagine our kids as an iceberg, you know, and the little tip you see at the top are just those behaviors that we see, and often not very behaviors that we're feeling very happy or proud of. But 3/4 of them is under the water, and that's most of them. That's the real thing going on, and we want to try and get at that. So again, looking at ways to talk to our kids that we can get underneath, and rather than staying up on the top there. There's always time later to let them know that swearing at me is not respectful, but I kind of think they know that already, and that's maybe why they're doing it. Maybe that won't work. Maybe you can't. There's no way I'm going to say, I'm glad you're having a bad day, or not glad you're having a bad day. Maybe you can't do that. So then sometimes the first step we suggest is just do nothing, because nothing is doing something. It's not causing any more harm. We didn't say this part would be easy, but we do really feel like it's effective. Small threads are all that you can do sometimes, and yet they can really feel big to our teens. Texting a thought or a message to them. Or I've just heard about little cartoon text where you can punch in a, you know, having a bad day, and a cute little cartoon can be sent off to someone as a way to bring humor into it. These are reminders that you love them and you want to be there for them despite their behavior. Because often our messages do come across as, I don't like you, rather than what I think it really is I'm worried about your behavior, I don't like your behavior. Leaving a favorite treat out for them. Doesn't it feel nice when someone's done something for you when you weren't even around, and to come home to that? Even if things are really strained, even if they're not coming home at all, being able to send a note saying, can we meet up sometime? Or do you want to come do your laundry here? Or even, you know, I'll bring you clean underwear. Something, some way of trying to connect up with them. These things aren't easy to do when our teens are struggling and acting in worrying ways. But remember, something tough is going on for them, and these can really help us get to that a lot easier than when we try using discipline or punishment or trying to get their behavior in line.
Mm-hmm. So as we were doing the presentation, as we were deciding what was on our slides, we realized that, you know, we're more used to being live in front of people and being able to actually get feedback in the moment. So Marianne and I pulled together a few statements that we commonly hear, and I just want to ask the people who are viewing to take a minute and think if any of these resonate with them, if any of the reactions are familiar. I think one of the ones that I actually hear is that I already do this. I do this already. I work on the relationship. There has to be more I can do. And the good news is, yes, there is more you can do. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But just really being able to be patient with the slow changes and focusing on the relationship is something that we can always do, even when other things don't seem to be working.
I think another one is saying, you know, I'm not going to let them get away with this, or they can't come on the trip now with us. And yet you want them on that trip with you, because that's a chance to connect and keep building the relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Another one too I find is, and I do this sometimes too, is this revert back to kind of common sense. Like common sense says that if I come down harder, then they'll know that that's the wrong thing. And why do they keep doing it when they know that, you know, and common sense or not common sense, I kind of think, you know, well, if it's working, that's great. Like, let's just keep doing. But if it's not working, you know, let's try something else. Yeah. I think that sometimes when we hear about changing the focus away from behavior to the relationship, it kind of feels like it's not enough, right? And sometimes it really does. These are our kids, so it feels like it's a life and death issue. But you know, really, the vast majority of teenagers, even those who struggle as adolescents with scary things, come out fine the other side. And if we can hang on to that while we're working with being connected with them, and trust that our connection is one of the things that that will continue to guide them in that right direction, can be really helpful.
I mean, don't they say if there's, you know, only one protective factor that you can need, that will help you get through, it's having a connection with a healthy adult. So we can almost see that too, as that's keeping us as that protective factor for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move into some of the kind of practical things.
So we picked a couple of communication skills, and there's so many different things we could have done, but we could only pick a couple that we've seen that really help get us to that point of being able to talk about the bigger issues with our teens. And I think these ones stuck out to us as being pretty effective pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. You know, listening is a really underrated skill. And yet, if you think about someone who you would like to go and talk to, when you want to share something with, when you're feeling really upset about something, isn't it the person who listens? I know for me, I don't go to that friend who is so quickly moves into trying to tell me what to do or give me advice. Mm-hmm. Also, I statements are really powerful. What I like about them is we can almost say anything to our teens without conflict and getting the best chance of being heard. You know, for example, if you're taking a big chance of getting hurt, if you want to say to your teen, you're taking a big chance of getting hurt if you don't wear a helmet skateboarding, or you have to wear a helmet. Another way of saying that is, I'm worrying about your brain when you skateboard without a helmet. Because, and actually, with an I statement, we're speaking more of the truth with the I statement. With a you statement, you're going to smash your brain. Actually, they may not. They may try and prove you wrong, and that might. You know, so it's not actually a fact. The other is more truthful about what we're feeling, and we like to convey that. And we've seen over and over that kids like much more to hear what we have to say when it comes from that place. So with relationship building as our goal, these are the skills that we found that might be most helpful right now.
That's great. Okay, so I want you to take a minute and just think that you're standing in the kitchen in the morning, and your teenager kind of staggers in and says, oh, I'm so tired. And you know they were out late the night before, and you believe that they were maybe under the influence, and you certainly know that they were out 3 nights this week, and there's a test this morning. What are some things you might say? So sometimes we go straight to problem solving or to fix it. You know, maybe you should go to bed earlier, honey. Or we like to offer the explanation. I wonder if being out late and drinking had anything to do with that. You know, and we can say it nicely, we can say it sarcastically, but what we're doing is we're responding in a way that I think isn't actually listening to the statement. You know, our teens often make a statement and we're assuming that they're asking for advice, they're asking us to fix it, or they're asking for our opinion. And in fact, none of that in that statement, I'm so tired, was right there. And I think that when especially young people with whom we have what feel like sort of tense or conflictual relationships, just say, oh, I'm so tired when they walk by. They're actually opening a little door. They're talking about something about how they feel. It's a little glimpse into what's going on with them. And, you know, maybe we don't want to just shut that down. So, you know, we can try things like more of a neutral response, you know, aha, like a little smile, or you're really tired. Just feed it back to them. Oh, you know, you're really tired. You can say, yeah, I'm a wreck when I don't get enough sleep, you know, without saying, that's why I go to bed so early, right? Like not sort of giving that advice, right? So trying not to offer advice or to explain. And we have a little note on the PowerPoint that says advanced skill, because, you know, if you're feeling calm, if you're feeling curious, if you're feeling like you want to keep the conversation going, you can ask curious questions that help them think. So if you think for a minute about a colleague, if a colleague walked into the office and heaved a big sigh and said, I'm so tired, we might say something like, oh yeah? Is there anything going on? You know, we probably wouldn't say, guess you went to bed too late. So we can ask questions of our youth. We can say things like, I wonder what you could do to be less tired in the morning. That's a tough one. And leave it to them to come up with an answer. Even if they say, you know, what do you mean? I just said I was tired. You can say, yeah. The point is that you didn't immediately lecture, or we don't right away assume that we know what the problem is, because the problem with those assumptions is that we risk being wrong. The child could have had nightmares, could be very stressed about something, could have been worrying all night. And then they're thinking, well, why should I tell you, right? Why should I tell you when you just go immediately to like, oh, it's my fault? You know, and what we do when we do that is we engage the back of the brain, and there's that resistance to being told what to do. So if we offer a mild, curious, open question, then we engage that front part of the brain for them to start thinking. And I'm not saying this is really easy. I say start with the listening. Don't need to go to the advanced skill. But what can be helpful is maybe to pretend that this is someone else's kid, right? Sometimes it's easier to access that around a nephew or a neighbor's child. Yeah.
I think what it really sounds like is that we just slow the process right down.
Yeah.
We can almost get to that place of problem solving in a different way. But I think with our anxiety, we want to speed it up. So it's really slowing that down gives them an opportunity, excuse me, to come up with some of those solutions too.
And I think as parents, we've spent something like 15 years thinking that we are the ones who need to have the answers. So, you know, it's normal.
Yeah. Forgetting our job is to help facilitate them coming up with answers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I statements is our other skill. Only other skill. That shifts, what we really see it doing is shifting the focus off of blaming our teen and focusing instead on how we feel and what we need. So kind of imagine it as a finger pointing. And it feels a lot more encouraging in relationship building to kind of say, I'm feeling this way rather than you should be doing this. So it brings us together more. I think it's more honest too, as it really does reflect what's really going on. You know, I may say, you're going to fail if you don't get your homework. And that actually may not be true. And yet I can say very clearly, I'm really worried about you failing if you don't get that homework done. And see how it would reduce a lot more of the conflict and kind of calm things down a little more. iMessages have us also consider that no one is responsible for our feelings but ourselves. And that's kind of a bit of a downer. Because you know, have you ever said to someone, you make me so mad? Placing responsibility for our feelings on somebody else, saying, you know, and that's something we do in our culture a lot, kind of say that someone else causes us how to feel. It's pretty ingrained and it's difficult to shift, and yet we can feel so much better if we can start saying, how am I going to make myself better, rather than feeling like I'm held hostage to my son or daughter in terms of their feelings. I'm going to feel happy if they're doing well and sad if they're not. Also, with you kind of make me feel this way, it's very disempowering. And also the teens, by placing teens in control of our feelings, and we can feel pretty victimized, out of control. So what can result from using I statements is that we are shifting the power back to us. So the main goal of an I statement, or the main goals, are we want to just describe the behavior of the situation in a non-blaming way. And that part's really important. We want to describe how the behavior is affecting you and how you're feeling about that. So on our slides, we've got kind of a wordy version of an I statement, which may not work for you, and we'll try a mini version after. But this will just kind of go through the different steps. So first, what we want to do is describe the behavior that we want to see change or that we're having a hard time with. So we may say, the school called for the 3rd time in a row to say you haven't been there. So don't say, you're never going to school. This is how we present it. School called, that's the fact. Say how you feel. I feel concerned. I feel worried about you. You know, I'm worried maybe because you're going to have to repeat this class. You might get behind in school. So we're kind of also stating some reasons or consequences that we see. We also want to acknowledge that our teen has this, the teen's autonomy, that they're becoming their own person, they're starting to take charge of things for themselves. So we want to say, I realize that you're starting to make your own decisions about school, and maybe I'd appreciate, or we can get the counselor to deal with you on that from now on. The other thing is, if they haven't been to school for the third day in a row, maybe something's going on that we want to ask them about. So it might be something hard happening, so we can always put that in there as well. It's important to offer help or show support. What can often happen when we get to this place, if we're trying to kind of get them to school and they're not going and we're battling about that, we might just throw up our hands at some point and say, okay, fine, do what you want, I don't care. You know, that can come out of our mouths. And yet we really do care. And this is an opportunity to kind of get around that. We can say, I'm here to help you. I can offer you support. Let me know what I can do. And then the last one is actually the most important one and the hardest one. We have to show trust. We really have to believe in our kids and that they can make some good decisions. Because the way we get to a place of making better decisions is to kind of make some mistakes and keep going at it. So at this point, we want to say, you know what, I'm sure you can manage this. I know you're capable of making a good decision around your school. So we have the completed I statement. The school called for the third time this week to say you weren't there. When that happens, I feel really concerned and worried. I'm worried that you're going to maybe have to go to summer school. I realize you're starting to make your own decisions, and maybe it's time that we get the counselor to speak with you directly about how to manage that. I'm here to help you in whatever way you need, within reason, and I know you can handle this. I know you can make a good decision. A mini version might just be, the school called and I'm worried about you, and we may want to leave the rest of that out, depending on where you're at. You know, sometimes when people deliver I statements, they can't, practice them at home, they'll come back the next week and say, it didn't work. They're not going to school still. And that's the problem. You know, we can't expect a specific outcome with an I message. It doesn't ensure the behavior is going to change right away, and that outcome is really out of our hands. But what it does do is it takes us into an interaction with our teen that's going to make things a lot better and actually can maybe lead them to a place where school's going to look differently for them. It becomes a lot less personal, and I think then there's a lot less conflict.
Yeah. There aren't any little magic bag of tricks.
No.
No. Which is why we're talking about process over outcome. So let's imagine that you're in a place where, you know, okay, I was going to do that.
I'm
no,
so sorry.
Let's imagine that we're in a place where we've been working on our I statements, we've been listening a ton. We feel like the relationship is more connected. We've actually started to have fun with our kids. And now, having put all the substance use stuff on hold, having put the lying and the behavior on hold, we're feeling like maybe we're in a circumstance where we can start having conversations, right? So what we want to do is have conversations that get them thinking about their use, okay? So we can ask them questions like, you know, tell me what's so good about it. Or, have you ever seen kids whose lives are affected by their use? And, you know, kind of, what does that look like? You know, we can ask them, how would you know if you had a problem? Like, what would that even look like? So I'm sure you can imagine how solid you have to feel in yourself to be able to have that, to be able to say something like that. The last question on the list here, what kind of thing would make you decide not to change anything? Is a scary question, because it feels like what we really want to be saying is, so what kind of thing would help you want to change something? And I'm not saying you can't ask that. Of course you can. See how the conversation goes. But it's really helpful to ask questions on the other side. What is so good about this? What would be a real drag about quitting? And so you're getting the youth to start to think from all sides. And what we're talking about here is having conversations that are effective, right? I mean, I totally agree. What should work is, you know, telling them their brains are still developing, there's social and emotional work they need to do. Let's put it off till you're in your 20s, right? Like, that should be enough. And for a lot of kids, it's not. I would like to comment that this whole idea of supporting, thinking about substance use for themselves and supporting our kids to think about making changes. There's a fantastic resource that says it's for teachers, but I think it's equally valuable for parents at the Centre for Addictions Research BC, so CAR BC. If you Google The Art of Motivating, University of Victoria, it's a web page that has lots of drop-down menus with these kinds of questions and ways that we can get in the right frame of mind to then have those conversations. Do you want to add anything to that?
No. I'll let you change the slide.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is a lot, and we're just asking you to maybe look at behavior through the filter of how it's affecting relationship, trying to look at things with a new lens. We're hoping that using iMessages can be helpful, but at first it really does feel like a new language, and sometimes people feel like they're walking on eggshells. Sometimes what people have been known to do is write a little script on the inside of their hand to kind of coach them through speaking. And you know what? Our teens don't mind. If we're making efforts and trying to be different, our kids are really understanding and supportive of us doing that. So it's okay to fumble around. I think that's, again, another way of teaching kids how to be comfortable with being awkward and making mistakes. And not being perfect at something. Listening, being curious, asking questions can be really difficult when we're scared about their choices, and yet that's a way that we can kind of help get them to look at maybe making them a bit differently.
Yeah. And I think that, that is kind of a downside. You start to hear more, you start to get more scared. I don't mean you personally, you hear more, get more scared. But I think that just trying to be in a place where we don't forecast disaster. There are many, many pathways to a healthy adulthood. And it's true that some of our kids take scary pathways, but the vast majority come out fine on the other side. And often, it's because of those experiences as adolescents, which they're learning from, that make them the people they end up being. And Marianne had a great example the other day, which was to try and imagine your child's adolescence as a novel with a happy ending. And all the way through the middle, there are going to be, sad scenes and scary scenes, but every chapter is a new chapter, and there are new influences coming in, and there are new things that happen that guide the person's character development. And I think that's a really great metaphor, because it's so easy for us to think, because of 3 bad decisions at 13, they're going to end up 5 miles down the road that way, right? When really development is more of a weaving process.
And there's research been done that suggests if we believe something is going to turn out well, it's much more likely going to happen than if it doesn't. So if we believe it's not going to turn out well, we're kind of leading them more in that direction. So that can be helpful to know too. Okay, so taking care of yourself is also a big piece about how we get through the adolescent time and make that work better. And sometimes people can say that feels condescending, like go take a bubble bath or have a cup of tea and I'll feel better.
Go to yoga.
Yeah. And so, but yet what we think about here is if there's something you're curious about doing, it can be really helpful on a couple of fronts. Trying something new takes you kind of out of the teen stuff for a while, and maybe even gets your brain to a place where you've completely forgotten about what's going on. And I think that's important. We need breaks from thinking about what's going on and worrying about it. So finding something that you're curious about can sometimes be helpful. Instead of maybe fighting about values, maybe we can act on them. So if we think education is really important, why don't we take a course and role model the usefulness of that or how much fun that can be? Want to take small steps, be patient, and that applies to us as well as to our teens. We talk a lot, as well as talking about late nights, we talk a lot about cookies, but it's really just a metaphor, getting them something, indulge them in some way, ways that we can reach out and look after them. We look after, if we look after self-care, we then have the strength to deal with what's going on with our teens. Another couple guiding pieces here is be the person you want your teen to be. Because sometimes when we have a real struggle through this time, and we're saying, I want you to be like me, live how I live. And how we're living right now is we're kind of grumpy or sad or mad all the time. We don't see our friends anymore. We don't do anything fun. All we're talking about is dirty dishes and messy rooms and whatever else. And so kids look to us and go, I don't really want to be like you. So I think it's really important for us to role model a good, happy life, be the person we want our kids to be, go out, have fun. I also think our kids feel really guilty when they see our lives get sadder or worse or falling apart because of what's going on with them. So that can also make them feel a lot better if they see us doing those things. Having a plan and just not kind of knee-jerk reacting to their behavior can also, just that in itself can be a useful way to be. So there's where we are.
Yeah. One of the things that you just said that I think works well with our final slide here is that, you know, as a parent, it feels so much better to have an approach, however you may choose to implement it, but to feel that you have an approach. At the end of the day, things may not have gone perfectly, but you can say, I have a plan, right? So it may not have gone as well as I hoped, but I'm going to keep focusing on building the relationship. I'm going to trust that strengthening our connection is going to allow us to have those conversations. You know, what the research does show us is that young people who have supportive and connected relationships with families and communities make better decisions across the board. And one of the things we often hear as a protective factor for youth is parental monitoring. And I really want to be clear about what the research shows in that. You know, the monitoring that comes from surveillance and from sneaking information and knowing what they're doing in that way actually isn't associated with better youth decision making. It's the parental knowledge of where they are and who they're with and what they're doing that comes because the young person feels comfortable to share it with the parent. So that is completely relational. That is the monitoring that is associated with lower substance use, lower rates of violence, higher levels of graduation, higher academics, and better relationships in youth lives. So I think that, you know, when we get the relationship to a point where they are willing to share with us, and then we can share back with them, we can really reap those benefits. Yeah. So we're done.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marianne and Alexandra. And I'm glad you've got a resource list there. And if parents have any questions, we have, the Force can obviously answer individual questions or provide specific resources, because you mentioned a few, and I'm wondering if we could get a list from you, and then we'll have it available, such as the Dan Siegel or some of the other, The Nature of Things and The Art of Motivating. We're to get that on the CAR BC website, which is a really useful and excellent tool to remind you of those skills of listening and iMessages and validating. But I did have one question, a couple of questions actually, that people, families often ask me. And when you had mentioned about really connecting with kids and trying to ask them about, you know, what's good about your substance use and how does that help, that often really freaks parents out, because their typical response is, well, then my kid's going to think that I'm okay with it. So how would you answer that for families when you're suggesting that they do engage with, tell me the good things about your substance use?
That's a common one, and feel like it's endorsement, but to me it's almost like finding out information. So if we can ask kids what's good about drugs, how are they helping you, we're getting the information of why they're using that substance. And people use substances for reasons, so that's getting those answers to us. So actually, I think it leads us on a path to maybe start providing a bit more help. Because if the answers are, I feel really anxious, or I'm really lonely and I hate that feeling, or I'm bored, you know, whatever those responses might be, then we can say, okay, how do we start helping you kind of add something in? So I'm not going to take those drugs away from you. I would like to, but if I can, how do we add in some supports around dealing with anxiety? Would you be willing to go talk to someone about that? Or can we add in ways to make your life a little more interesting so you're not feeling so bored? So I definitely think it provides us with the information we need to know why they're using.
May I add something? I think sometimes it's very hard as parents to get that information. Our teens don't come up to us and say necessarily, you know, I'm anxious every day, or I'm feeling really lonely. So if that question brings out that information, to me that's amazing that you could know.
That's probably the top question that I get asked, and it's so helpful for you to reinforce that to families, that the message is not that, hey, this is great you're using, let's talk about how great it is. That is in fact not And usually when a discussion like that takes place, typically, then they start to say, well, I do sometimes have a headache the next day, or whatever it may
It
be.
opens the door. So I want to say, let me talk about the good stuff, and then we can open the door to talk about the other side of that. And if you feel like you're endorsing or worried of that, you can always put that in. I'm not endorsing, and I'm just curious why it's working for you. How is it helpful for you? Kids feel more understood, and the relationship gets more connected there too.
Well, thanks for clarifying for that. That's really helpful for families. And you mentioned about self-care. And as you said, families often feel like, give me a break. You know, I don't have time for self-care. I mean, my kid's life or whatever is at stake. And I think the force, we often use the analogy of the oxygen mask. So if it's helpful for families, if you've watched any of the webinars, the In the Nose, you'll have heard the metaphor of using, or the analogy of putting your oxygen mask on first, so that you can then be there in a better space. And when you had earlier alluded to sort of that catastrophe, families are feeling like this is really dangerous, and it might be, but the important piece around that is when you have put your oxygen mask on, then you're in a better place to not react to that feeling of this is really scary, and you are able to respond versus react. So is that something you'd like to add to that piece?
I think it's all of that, and I think we really wear ourselves out worrying about things that aren't happening, and it doesn't, so we don't have the reserve. When the thing actually happens, we're actually less able to deal with it because we've exhausted ourselves. I also really do like the line, be the person you want your kids to be, or role model a happy life, because I think that also gives our kids some direction around that. So if you don't even want to do self-care for you, do it for your kids, you know? And that kind of also shifts you back to that place.
Yeah, that's helpful. Families feel really guilty with self-care. So if you're feeling guilty, then do it for your kid.
And you know, I think if I can add, I think the whole self-care, I have quite a reaction to that myself, and it almost makes me not want to do it because it's I do well about that. But one of the things that someone told me was, instead of trying to go look for your passions, we always tell it, look for your passions, you know, look for your curiosity. And the idea that I know for myself in my own life, the idea that I could somehow do something for 15 minutes that would turn into an hour, and I would realize I had forgotten. Like, what a break for an hour that I actually forgot what was going on. And that, I think one of our slides said, in order to be able to do this, you need to have some reserves. And that really, I think, gives you reserves.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And just before we end, I think the other really important piece for me is the ability for families to stay curious. And so when you do use the I statements and you practice listening, you want to listen with true curiosity and a strengths-based approach. And I think you really emphasized that it's really important to stay curious. So then your questions come from a place of sincerity, because your kids they're master detectives of sarcasm. So I just wonder if you could add quickly to
Well, I think
to
we
that.
talk about those questions. You don't want to be an interrogator, you know? So there's those questions that we actually ask, you know, when parents come to our groups. At the beginning, just stop asking questions. See what a difference can make a big difference. And if you are going to ask questions, they've got to come from that curious place, not I know the answer and I'm trying to trip you up. You know, entrapment kinds of questions. Really want to be curious. I want to know more about you so I can help you more.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying that as well. So those are the top concerns that seem to come up for families. So thank you both so much, Marianne and Alexandra. And thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar, Paying Attention, Relationship on Behavior, Parenting with a Different Focus in Mind. So please take a few moments to fill out the online feedback form located in the resources section of this webinar by clicking on the paperclip icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much.